In the quiet hills of Ukraine, a chemistry student named Lyudmila Pavlichenko picked up a rifle for the first time. She had no idea that this moment would transform her into the deadliest female sniper in human history, with 309 confirmed kills that would make even the most seasoned military veterans pause in respect. What started as a simple decision to defend her homeland would lead to a record that has never been broken, a 3,247-meter shot that defied every law of physics and human capability known at the time. This is not just a story about war. This is the story of a woman who rewrote the rules of combat, faced down death 309 times, and lived to tell about it. But, before she became a legend, before her name struck fear into the hearts of enemy soldiers, before she stood in the White House meeting with world leaders, Lyudmila was just cleaning her rifle one ordinary morning when everything changed forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the university courtyard in Kiev as Lyudmila Pavlichenko hurried to her chemistry class. It was 1941, and, at 24 years old, she was focused on her studies and her young son. The world seemed full of possibilities, and war felt like something that happened in distant places to other people. She had no way of knowing that in just a few months, she would be holding a different kind of instrument entirely. Lyudmila had always been different from other girls her age. While her classmates dreamed of romance and fashion, she found herself drawn to precision and challenge. Her father, a watchmaker, had taught her to appreciate the delicate mechanisms that made things work perfectly. Every tiny gear had its place, every spring its tension, every movement its purpose. This attention to detail would later save her life hundreds of times over. Growing up in a small village outside Kiev, Lyudmila learned to hunt with her grandfather. The old man had fought in the Great War and understood that survival often depended on skills that polite society preferred to ignore. He taught her to read the wind, to control her breathing, to squeeze the trigger with the gentle pressure of a whisper. She was a natural, hitting targets that grown men missed. Her grandfather would nod approvingly and say, "Little wolf, you have the gift." When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, everything changed overnight. The news reached Kiev like a shock wave, transforming the peaceful university town into a place of urgent preparation and barely controlled panic. Students abandoned their books for rifles, professors traded their lectures for military strategy, and young women like Lyudmila faced an impossible choice: flee to safety or stay and fight. Lyudmila made her decision while standing in the recruitment office, watching nervous young men sign their names to military papers. The recruiting officer looked at her with barely concealed amusement. Women, he explained with condescending patience, could serve as nurses or radio operators. Combat roles were for men. She listened politely, then asked if she could demonstrate her shooting ability. The makeshift shooting range behind the recruitment center had been hastily constructed from sandbags and wooden targets. Several male recruits had already tried and failed to hit the center rings consistently. Lyudmila borrowed a standard-issue Mosin-Nagant rifle, checked the sight alignment with the practiced ease of someone who had done this thousands of times, and proceeded to put 5 shots through the exact center of a target at 200 meters. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of spent cartridges rolling across the concrete floor. The recruiting officer stared at the target through his binoculars, then at Lyudmila, then back at the target. Without another word, he stamped her papers for combat duty with the 25th Rifle Division. Her first assignment was to the defense of Odessa, a strategic port city on the Black Sea. The journey south revealed a country transforming itself for total war. Factories that had produced tractors now churned out tanks. Farms that had grown wheat now grew soldiers. The very landscape seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm that was coming. In Odessa, Lyudmila met her first sniper instructor, a grizzled veteran named Fyodor who had learned his craft fighting the Japanese in Mongolia. He took one look at her university education and delicate features and assigned her to what he assumed would be a brief and unsuccessful military career. That assumption lasted exactly as long as it took for her to complete the sniper training course. The course was designed to break ordinary soldiers and forge them into something harder, more precise, more deadly. Students learned to move across open ground without being seen, to remain motionless for hours in uncomfortable positions, to calculate wind speed and bullet drop by instinct rather than mathematics. Most importantly, they learned to kill efficiently and without hesitation. Ludmilla excelled at every aspect of the training except one: she struggled with the psychological weight of taking human life. During practice sessions with moving targets and wooden silhouettes, she was flawless. But, when Fyodor spoke about the reality of combat, about looking through a scope and seeing not an enemy soldier but a young man with a family and dreams, she found herself questioning whether she could actually pull the trigger when the moment came. The answer came during her first combat deployment on the outskirts of Odessa. German advance units had established positions in a cluster of abandoned buildings, and their snipers were picking off Soviet soldiers with devastating effectiveness. Ludmilla was assigned to a hastily constructed high position in the ruins of a bombed church, with orders to provide counter-sniper support for an infantry advance. She had been in position for 3 hours, moving only to adjust her scope and track the movement of enemy soldiers through the rubble below, when she saw him. A German sniper had taken position in a bell tower roughly 400 meters away, and he was methodically working his way through a group of Soviet medics who were trying to evacuate wounded soldiers from an exposed courtyard. Through her scope, Ludmilla could see the German sniper's face clearly. He was young, probably no older than she was, with fair hair and the kind of concentrated expression she recognized from her own face in mirrors. He was skilled, taking careful shots and making each one count. As she watched, he lined up another shot at a medic who was dragging a wounded soldier to safety. The decision came without conscious thought. Ludmilla adjusted for range and wind, controlled her breathing, and squeezed the trigger with the same gentle pressure her grandfather had taught her years earlier. The shot was perfect, striking the German sniper center mass and ending his threat to the medics below. She remained in position for another 6 hours, taking 2 more shots and scoring 2 more kills. When the infantry advance finally secured the area, she climbed down from the church bell tower feeling fundamentally changed. The theoretical had become real, and there was no going back. That night, sitting in a makeshift mess tent eating cold rations by candlelight, Fyodor approached her with a different expression than she had seen before. He had heard about her performance from the infantry commanders, and he no longer looked at her as a university student playing at being a soldier. He saw a sniper. Over the following weeks, Ludmilla's kill count began to climb steadily. Each enemy soldier eliminated was carefully documented, verified by spotters and commanders, and recorded in her service record. 10 kills became 20, 20 became 50. Her reputation began to spread through the Soviet lines, and enemy forces started to take notice as well. The Germans responded by bringing in their own elite snipers, specialists trained in the hunting schools of Bavaria and Austria. These men had honed their skills hunting game in the mountains and forests of Central Europe, and they brought to the battlefield a level of patience and precision that made them extraordinarily dangerous opponents. Ludmilla found herself engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse, where the slightest mistake meant death. She learned to think like her opponents, to anticipate their movements, to set traps and avoid the ones set for her. Each duel was a chess match played with bullets, where the stakes were measured in lives rather than points. Her first major sniper duel lasted 3 days and took place in the ruins of a factory complex outside Odessa. A German sniper known only by his call sign Wolf had been terrorizing Soviet positions, accumulating over 30 kills in just 2 weeks. Command assigned Ludmilla to eliminate him, providing her with detailed intelligence about his habits and preferred positions. The hunt began before dawn on a gray October morning. Ludmilla positioned herself in a water tower that offered excellent views of the factory complex, while her spotter took position in a nearby building with radio equipment and backup weapons. For hours, they watched and waited, searching for any sign of Wolf's presence. The first indication came at midday, when a Soviet patrol moving through the factory grounds suddenly came under fire. One soldier dropped immediately, struck by a bullet that seemed to come from nowhere. Ludmilla studied the trajectory and calculated the probable firing position, but she could see no muzzle flash, no movement, no indication of where Wolf might be hiding. For the next 2 days, the deadly game continued. Wolf would strike without warning, claiming another victim, then vanish back into the maze of destroyed machinery and collapsed buildings. Ludmilla changed positions repeatedly, trying to anticipate his next move, but he seemed to stay always one step ahead. The breakthrough came on the 3rd morning, when Ludmilla noticed something that had been bothering her subconsciously for days. A piece of machinery in the factory courtyard, a large lathe that had been knocked over during the initial bombardment, was positioned at a slightly different angle than it had been the day before. The difference was minute, barely noticeable, but it suggested that someone had been using it as concealment and had moved it to improve their field of fire. She spent the entire morning studying that lathe through her scope, looking for any sign of human presence. Just after noon, she saw it, a tiny reflection of sunlight off glass, gone so quickly she might have imagined it. But snipers learn to trust their instincts, and her instincts told her that Wolf was hiding behind that overturned machine. The shot was one of the longest she had attempted up to that point, nearly 600 meters through industrial terrain that created tricky wind patterns and visual distortions. She calculated the trajectory, adjusted for the estimated wind speed, and took the kind of deep breath that hunters use to steady themselves before taking game. When she fired, the bullet traveled for what seemed like an eternity before striking home. Through her scope, she saw a figure in German field gray uniform crumple behind the lathe, and she knew that Wolf would hunt no more. Her kill count had reached 78 when the order came to evacuate Odessa. The city could no longer be held against the German advance, and Soviet forces were conducting a strategic withdrawal to more defensible positions. For Ludmila, this meant leaving behind the familiar terrain where she had learned to fight and moving to an even more dangerous assignment, the defense of Sevastopol. Sevastopol was different from anything Ludmila had experienced before. The ancient port city, built into the rocky cliffs overlooking the Black Sea, was a fortress that had withstood sieges for centuries. But this siege would be unlike any in history, with modern artillery, aircraft, and some of the most elite military units that Nazi Germany could field. The city was already under bombardment when Ludmila arrived in late October 1941. German forces had surrounded Sevastopol on 3 sides, leaving only the sea as an escape route. The defenders were trapped, but they were also defending one of the most strategically important naval bases in the Soviet Union. Both sides understood that this battle would be fought to the bitter end. Ludmila was assigned to the 54th Regiment, which held positions in the northern sector of the defensive perimeter. This area consisted of a maze of concrete bunkers, underground tunnels, and fortified positions that had been carved directly into the limestone cliffs. It was perfect sniper country, offering countless hiding places and clear fields of fire across the approaches that enemy forces would have to cross. Her new commanding officer, Major Petrov, was a career military man who had survived the purges of the 1930s through a combination of competence and political caution. He looked at Ludmila's service record from Odessa and made a decision that would prove crucial to the defense of the city. He gave her complete freedom to operate wherever and however she thought best. This independence was rare in the rigid hierarchy of the Soviet military, but Petrov understood that snipers were not ordinary soldiers. They needed to think independently, to improvise and adapt to changing conditions, to make split-second decisions that could affect the outcome of entire battles. He provided Ludmila with her own spotter, a young soldier named Leonid who had grown up hunting in the forests of Siberia, and told them to make life miserable for the Germans. They did exactly that. Working together, Ludmila and Leonid developed a system of rotating positions and coordinated attacks that made it nearly impossible for German forces to predict where they might strike next. They would spend days studying enemy patterns, identifying weak points and vulnerable targets, then strike with devastating precision before melting away into the maze of defensive positions. The Germans responded by bringing in some of their best counter-sniper specialists. These were not ordinary soldiers but elite marksmen who had trained for years in specialized schools and hunting academies. They carried the finest rifles that German industry could produce, equipped with advanced optics and custom ammunition. Many had accumulated impressive kill counts on the Eastern Front and were confident that dealing with one Soviet sniper, even a skilled one, would be a straightforward matter. They were wrong. Ludmila had advantages that her opponents did not fully appreciate. She knew the terrain intimately, having spent weeks mapping every rock, every building, every possible position and approach. She understood the daily rhythms of the siege, when supply convoys moved, when guard changes occurred, when enemy commanders felt safe enough to venture into exposed positions. Most importantly, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to read her opponents. Years of hunting and months of combat had taught her to think like her prey, to anticipate their decisions, to set traps and avoid the ones set for her. She could look at a position and immediately understand its strengths and weaknesses, its possibilities and limitations. Her first major duel in Sevastopol began in early November when a German sniper took position in the ruins of a school building about 800 meters from her primary hide. This sniper, who the defenders nicknamed the Professor because of his methodical approach and academic precision, had already killed 17 Soviet soldiers in just 4 days. The Professor was unlike previous opponents Ludmila had faced. He showed remarkable patience, sometimes going entire days without taking a shot while he studied the defensive positions and learned the habits of their occupants. When he did shoot, his shots were invariably fatal, placed with surgical precision in gaps in armor or fortifications that seemed impossibly small. Ludmila spent a week studying the Professor, learning his patterns and preferences. She discovered that he favored early morning shots, when the light was soft and shadows provided maximum concealment. He preferred targets of opportunity over planned ambushes, waiting for soldiers to expose themselves rather than trying to force engagements. Most importantly, he was left-handed, which meant his natural tendency would be to seek positions that offered good fields of fire to the right side of his hiding place. Armed with this knowledge, Ludmila began to set a trap. She identified a position in a bombed-out apartment building that would be perfect for a left-handed sniper seeking to cover a particular section of the Soviet defensive line. The position offered excellent concealment, multiple escape routes, and clear shots at several high-value targets that the Professor had been attempting to engage for days. The trap required patience and perfect timing. Ludmila positioned herself in a carefully selected hide that offered a clear view of the apartment building, then began what amounted to psychological warfare. She started taking shots from positions that would drive the Professor toward the apartment building, making other locations seem too dangerous while leaving the apartment building apparently safe and attractive. The plan worked perfectly. After 3 days of pressure, the Professor moved to the apartment building exactly as Ludmila had anticipated. She watched through her scope as he established his position, arranged his equipment, and settled in for what he clearly expected to be a productive morning of hunting Soviet soldiers. He never got the chance. Ludmila's shot traveled 850 meters through the crisp November air and struck him precisely as he was adjusting his rifle scope for his first shot of the day. The bullet entered just below his left ear, and the Professor's war was over in an instant that he never saw coming. Word of this kill spread rapidly through both the Soviet and German lines. For the defenders, it was proof that their sniper was not just skilled but tactically brilliant, capable of outthinking and outmaneuvering the best that the enemy could send against her. For the Germans, it was a sobering reminder that they were facing an opponent unlike any they had encountered before. The Germans responded by changing their tactics. Instead of sending individual snipers to hunt Ludmila, they began deploying sniper teams supported by observers, radio operators, and artillery spotters. The idea was to use superior numbers and coordination to overwhelm her advantages in terrain knowledge and tactical thinking. This escalation led to some of the most intense sniper warfare in military history. The area around Sevastopol became a deadly chessboard where every move carried lethal consequences. Ludmila found herself facing multiple opponents simultaneously, each one skilled and determined, each one representing a threat that could end her war in a single moment of carelessness. She adapted by becoming even more unpredictable. She developed a network of secondary positions, weapons caches, and observation points that allowed her to operate across a much wider area than any single sniper could normally cover. She learned to coordinate with artillery and mortar units, using their fire to mask her movement and create opportunities for shots that would otherwise be impossible. Most importantly, she began training other snipers, sharing the knowledge and techniques she had developed through months of combat experience. Major Petrov authorized the creation of a small sniper school in one of the underground bunkers, where Ludmila taught selected soldiers the art of precision shooting and battlefield survival. These students proved to be force multipliers, extending Ludmila's influence across the entire northern sector. They could not match her skill or experience, but they could handle routine targets while she focused on the most dangerous threats. More importantly, they could provide security and support that allowed her to take greater risks and attempt more ambitious operations. One such operation occurred in December, when German forces attempted to establish an observation post in a factory tower that commanded views of the entire Soviet defensive line. The tower was over 1,200 meters from any Soviet position, well beyond the effective range of most weapons and protected by multiple layers of defensive positions. The mission required Lyudmila to move outside the established defensive perimeter and work her way to within effective range of the tower. This meant crossing nearly 2 kilometers of contested ground, much of it under direct observation by German sentries and patrol units. The journey took 3 nights of careful movement, using drainage ditches, bomb craters, and destroyed buildings for concealment. When she finally reached a suitable firing position, Lyudmila discovered that the Germans had posted not 1 but 3 observers in the tower, working in shifts to maintain constant surveillance of the Soviet lines. Eliminating all 3 would require perfect timing and flawless execution, because any survivor would immediately alert German forces to her presence and bring down artillery fire on her position. She waited until the shift change at dawn, when all 3 observers were briefly present in the tower at the same time. Her first shot eliminated the primary observer, her second took out the radio operator before he could transmit a warning, and her third silenced the backup observer as he reached for his weapon. The retreat to Soviet lines was harrowing, with German patrols converging on her last known position and artillery shells falling like rain across the area where she had been operating. She made it back to safety with minutes to spare, carrying intelligence about German positions and defenses that proved invaluable for planning future operations. By January 1942, Lyudmila's kill count had reached 187, making her one of the most successful snipers in the Soviet military. More importantly, she had become a symbol of resistance for the defenders of Sevastopol and a source of frustration and fear for the German forces attempting to take the city. The Germans decided to end the threat she represented by deploying their most elite sniper, a man known only as the Ghost, who had accumulated over 400 confirmed kills on the Eastern Front. The Ghost was legendary among German snipers, a master craftsman of death who had never failed to eliminate a target once he had been assigned to hunt them. The duel between Lyudmila and the Ghost would last for weeks and become the stuff of legend among soldiers on both sides. It was a contest between 2 perfect predators, each one testing the limits of skill, patience, and determination. Only one of them would survive to see the spring. The arrival of the Ghost in Sevastopol was announced not by official reports or intelligence briefings, but by the sudden silence that fell over the German lines. For weeks, Lyudmila had grown accustomed to the rhythm of enemy sniper activity, predictable patterns of movement and engagement that she had learned to read like a familiar book. Now, that rhythm had changed completely. The Ghost was unlike any opponent she had faced before. While other snipers revealed their presence through their kills, he seemed to hunt without leaving any trace at all. Soviet soldiers simply disappeared from their posts, found hours later with single bullet wounds that spoke of impossible shots taken from positions that offered no concealment. He was earning his reputation not just through skill, but through an almost supernatural ability to remain invisible even while killing. Intelligence reports provided few details about this mysterious sniper. German prisoners spoke of him in whispers, describing a man who had learned his craft hunting wolves in the mountains of Bavaria before the war. They said he could remain motionless for days, that he could shoot accurately in conditions that would defeat ordinary marksmen, that he had never missed a target he had chosen to eliminate. What concerned Lyudmila most was not his skill, but his patience. Previous German snipers had been aggressive, eager to rack up kills and prove their superiority. The Ghost seemed content to study his opponents for weeks before making his move, learning their habits and weaknesses with the methodical precision of a scientist conducting research. The first sign of his presence came on a frozen February morning when Senior Lieutenant Kozlov, one of Lyudmila's former students, simply vanished from his post overlooking the harbor approaches. Kozlov was found hours later, killed by a single shot that had traveled over 900 meters through industrial smog and morning mist to strike him precisely in the temple. The angle of the shot suggested the shooter had been positioned in an area that Soviet forces had believed to be impassable. More kills followed over the next week, each one demonstrating capabilities that seemed almost impossible. A radio operator was eliminated while working inside what had been considered a perfectly concealed bunker. A forward observer was killed while lying flat in a shell crater that should have offered complete protection from enemy fire. An ammunition carrier was struck while moving through a tunnel that had no direct line of sight to any known German position. The psychological impact was devastating. Soldiers who had fought bravely against conventional attacks began to show signs of the particular terror that comes from facing an invisible enemy. They flinched at shadows, hesitated to move between positions, and spoke in hushed tones about the German sniper who could apparently shoot through solid rock. Major Petrov called Ludmila to his command bunker and laid out the situation with characteristic bluntness. The Ghost was killing too many key personnel and destroying the morale of an entire sector. Something had to be done, and she was the only one with the skill and experience to do it. Ludmila accepted the mission with the same calm professionalism she brought to every assignment, but privately she understood that she was being asked to risk everything on a single outcome. If she failed, the Ghost would continue his deadly work and she would join the growing list of his victims. If she succeeded, she would eliminate a threat that could single-handedly affect the outcome of the siege. The hunt began with careful intelligence gathering. Ludmila studied the locations of every kill the Ghost had made, mapping them on a detailed chart of the city and looking for patterns that might reveal his methods or preferred positions. What she discovered was deeply troubling. The Ghost was not operating from a single hide or even a small number of established positions. Instead, he seemed to be moving constantly, taking shots from locations that should have been impossible to reach and then vanishing without a trace. His mobility was extraordinary, suggesting either supernatural abilities or a level of battlefield knowledge that should have taken months to acquire. The breakthrough came when Ludmila realized she was approaching the problem from the wrong direction. Instead of trying to track the Ghost's movements, she began studying the terrain itself, looking for routes and positions that might allow such mobility while remaining hidden from Soviet observation. What she found was a network of collapsed buildings, underground passages, and natural rock formations that created a hidden highway running through the German-controlled areas around Sevastopol. Someone with detailed knowledge of this network could move across kilometers of contested ground without ever exposing himself to enemy observation. This discovery suggested something even more disturbing. The Ghost had either conducted an extraordinarily thorough reconnaissance of the area before beginning his hunting, or he had local assistance from someone intimately familiar with the city's geography. Either possibility meant she was facing an opponent who possessed advantages she could not match through skill alone. Ludmila decided to turn this advantage against him by forcing him to operate outside his comfort zone. She began a campaign of psychological warfare designed to draw him into engagements on her terms rather than his. The strategy required her to become bait, exposing herself to draw his fire while positioning herself to respond with devastating effect. The first phase involved establishing a series of false positions equipped with dummy targets designed to look like occupied sniper hides. These decoys were placed in locations that would be attractive to a sniper hunting other snipers, offering clear fields of fire and apparent concealment while actually being under observation from Ludmila's true position. The plan worked better than she had dared hope. 3 days after establishing the decoys, one of them came under fire from a position over 1,100 meters away. The shot was perfect, striking the dummy target precisely where a real sniper's head would have been, but the muzzle flash gave away the Ghost's location for the split second that Ludmila needed to see him. She did not return fire immediately. Instead, she spent the rest of the day studying the position through her scope, learning its characteristics and planning her approach. The Ghost had chosen well. His hide was nearly invisible from ground level and offered multiple escape routes. But it also had weaknesses that could be exploited by someone patient enough to wait for the right opportunity. That opportunity came the following morning when the Ghost returned to the same position, apparently confident that his location remained secret. Ludmila had positioned herself 800 meters away with a clear shot at the only angle that would penetrate his concealment. When he exposed himself for what should have been a routine shot at another decoy target, she was ready. Her shot missed by inches, striking the concrete wall just behind where the Ghost's head had been a moment before. But it accomplished something more valuable than a kill. It announced that Ludmila had found him and was actively hunting him in return. What followed was a deadly game of move and counter-move that lasted for nearly 3 weeks. The Ghost would establish a position and take a shot, revealing his location. Ludmila would respond by maneuvering to threaten that position, forcing him to move. Each engagement brought them closer to a final confrontation, and both snipers understood that only one of them would survive to see the spring. The Ghost adapted his tactics, becoming even more cautious and unpredictable. He began using flash suppressors and smokeless powder to hide his muzzle flashes, making it nearly impossible to spot him when he fired. He started taking shots during artillery bombardments, using the noise and confusion to mask his fire and movement. Ludmilla responded by becoming more aggressive, taking greater risks to close the distance between them. She began operating at night, using darkness for concealment while employing sound to track her opponent's movements. She learned to predict his likely positions by studying the targets he chose and the angles he preferred for his shots. The final confrontation came on a gray March morning when both snipers found themselves in adjacent buildings separated by less than 300 meters of rubble-strewn ground. They had been stalking each other for hours, each one aware of the other's presence but unable to achieve a clear shot. The Ghost made his move first, attempting to reach a position that would give him a clear field of fire at Ludmilla's suspected location. But she had anticipated this move and had positioned herself to intercept him during his movement between buildings. When he exposed himself for the 3 seconds necessary to cross an open courtyard, Ludmilla was waiting with her rifle already trained on the exact spot where he would appear. Her shot was perfect, striking him center mass and ending one of the most intense sniper duels in military history. The death of the Ghost had immediate and profound effects on the siege of Sevastopol. German sniper activity dropped dramatically as word spread that their most elite marksman had been eliminated by the Soviet sniper they had been trying to kill for months. Morale in the Soviet defensive positions soared as soldiers realized that their champion had once again proven superior to the best the enemy could send against her. Ludmilla's kill count had reached 242, but, more importantly, she had established herself as more than just a skilled sniper. She had become a symbol of Soviet resistance and determination, proof that individual skill and courage could triumph over seemingly impossible odds. However, her growing fame was also becoming a liability. German forces were now dedicating significant resources to eliminating her, including artillery bombardments targeted at her suspected positions and commando raids designed to capture or kill her. The very success that made her valuable to Soviet morale also made her a target that was becoming increasingly difficult to protect. The situation reached a crisis point in late March when a German artillery barrage struck the bunker complex where Ludmilla had been operating. The bombardment was so intense and precisely targeted that it could only have been directed by someone with intimate knowledge of her movements and preferences. Ludmilla survived the attack, but barely. Shrapnel wounds left her partially deaf in one ear and temporarily blinded in her left eye. More seriously, the attack had killed Leonid, her spotter and closest friend in the war. The loss was devastating both tactically and personally, removing not just a skilled partner but the person who had shared every danger and victory of the past months. As she recovered from her wounds in a makeshift medical facility deep underground, Ludmilla faced a decision that would determine not just her own fate, but her place in history. The doctors recommended that she be evacuated from Sevastopol for medical treatment and reassignment to a safer position. Her commanders suggested that she had already done more than enough and deserved to be rotated to a training role where her experience could be used to prepare the next generation of Soviet snipers. But Sevastopol was still under siege, and the fighting was entering its most critical phase. German forces were preparing for what they hoped would be a final assault that would break the Soviet defenses and capture the city. Every skilled defender would be needed for the battles ahead, and Ludmilla knew that her absence could mean the difference between victory and defeat for the defenders she had fought alongside for so many months. She chose to stay, but the decision would lead to challenges that would test not just her skills as a sniper, but her ability to survive in conditions that would have defeated lesser soldiers. Recovery from her wounds took longer than anyone expected. The shrapnel damage to her left eye had been severe enough to leave permanent blind spots in her peripheral vision, while the hearing loss in her left ear made it difficult to judge distances by sound. For a sniper, these disabilities were potentially career-ending, but Ludmilla refused to accept that limitation. Working with a military doctor named Captain Volkov, she developed a series of exercises designed to compensate for her injuries. She learned to rely more heavily on her right eye for targeting while using her damaged left eye for peripheral awareness. She trained herself to read wind patterns through visual cues rather than sound, studying the movement of grass, leaves, and debris to calculate atmospheric conditions. Most importantly, she learned to work with a new spotter. Private Dmitri was younger than Leonid had been, barely 19 years old, but he possessed an extraordinary gift for mathematics and spatial reasoning. What he lacked in combat experience, he made up for in his ability to calculate range, windage, and trajectory with lightning speed and remarkable accuracy. By mid-April, Ludmilla was back in action, but the battlefield had changed dramatically during her recovery. The German forces surrounding Sevastopol had been reinforced with elite units transferred from successful campaigns in other sectors. They now outnumbered the defenders by more than 3-1 and possessed overwhelming advantages in artillery, aircraft, and armor. The final German offensive began on May 7, 1942, with an artillery bombardment that exceeded anything the defenders had experienced during the entire siege. For 3 days, German guns fired continuously, turning large sections of the city into moonscapes of craters and rubble. When the barrage finally lifted, it was replaced by wave after wave of infantry attacks supported by tanks and dive bombers. Ludmilla found herself fighting not as a traditional sniper but as a designated marksman in a desperate battle for survival. She moved from position to position, taking quick shots at high-value targets before relocating to avoid the artillery fire that seemed to follow her everywhere. Her kill count continued to climb, reaching 267, then 278, then 289 as the battles raged through the streets and ruins of Sevastopol. The most critical moment of the siege came on May 15, when German forces achieved a breakthrough in the northern sector that threatened to split the Soviet defensive line in half. A German assault battalion had established itself in a cluster of buildings that commanded the main supply route into the city, making it impossible for Soviet forces to reinforce their forward positions. The key to the German position was an observation post in a church tower that directed artillery fire and coordinated infantry attacks across the entire sector. Multiple attempts to assault the position had failed, with attacking forces being cut down by precisely directed fire before they could reach the church. Major Petrov called Ludmilla to his emergency command post and presented her with an impossible mission. The observation post had to be eliminated, but it was positioned over 3,200 meters from the nearest Soviet position and was protected by multiple rings of defensive positions. No sniper in history had ever made a confirmed kill at such a distance, and the environmental conditions made the shot even more challenging. The church tower stood on a hill overlooking the harbor, where thermal currents from the sun-heated water created constantly shifting wind patterns. The target would be a single human figure visible for only brief moments as he moved between observation equipment, and the shot would have to be taken during daylight hours when atmospheric distortion would be at its worst. Ludmilla studied the problem for hours, using binoculars and range-finding equipment to map every variable that might affect the shot. She calculated wind speed and direction at multiple altitudes, estimated the temperature gradients that would deflect her bullet, and planned her firing position to minimize atmospheric interference. The mathematics were daunting. At 3,200 meters, her bullet would take nearly 4 seconds to reach the target, during which time it would be affected by gravity, wind, temperature changes, and the Coriolis effect caused by the Earth's rotation. The margin of error was measured in inches, while the external factors affecting the shot were measured in meters. Working with Dmitri, she developed what amounted to a firing solution that required perfect conditions and flawless execution. They would need to wait for a specific combination of wind direction, temperature, and atmospheric pressure that occurred only rarely during the day. When those conditions aligned, Ludmilla would have perhaps 30 seconds to identify her target and take the shot. They established their position in the ruins of a hospital that offered a clear line of sight to the church tower while providing some concealment from German observers. The position was dangerous, well within range of enemy artillery and exposed to counter-sniper fire, but it was the only location that offered the necessary angle and distance for the shot. For 3 days, they waited and watched, studying the patterns of activity in the church tower and looking for the perfect combination of environmental conditions. Dmitri took continuous measurements with improvised instruments, tracking wind speed, temperature, and humidity while calculating the precise firing solution they would need when the moment came. The opportunity finally presented itself on the morning of May 18, during a brief lull in the fighting when atmospheric conditions achieved the stability they had been waiting for. The wind had dropped to almost nothing, the temperature had stabilized, and visibility was as clear as they were likely to see during the daylight hours. Through her scope, Ludmilla could see a figure moving in the church tower, directing artillery fire against Soviet positions. The range was extreme, making the target appear impossibly small even at maximum magnification, but she could make out enough detail to identify him as the primary observer whose elimination would cripple German fire control for the entire sector. The shot would require everything she had learned during her months of combat experience. She controlled her breathing using techniques that had become second nature, steadied her rifle on a specially constructed rest that eliminated every possible source of movement, and calculated the precise aiming point that would compensate for all the variables affecting the bullet's flight. When she fired, the recoil knocked her scope slightly off target, preventing her from observing the bullet's impact. For nearly 4 seconds, she and Dmitri waited in silence, watching the church tower through binoculars and trying to determine whether the shot had found its mark. The answer came when the German artillery fire that had been falling on Soviet positions suddenly stopped. Through their binoculars, they could see confused activity in the church tower as other observers tried to understand what had happened to their primary spotter. The precision that had characterized German fire control disappeared, replaced by wild shots that fell harmlessly in empty areas. Ludmila had achieved the impossible, a confirmed kill at 3,247 meters, a distance that would not be exceeded by any sniper for decades to come. More importantly, she had eliminated a key target whose death would save countless Soviet lives and help stabilize the defensive line during the most critical phase of the siege. The shot became legendary almost immediately. Word spread through the Soviet lines faster than official reports could travel, carried by soldiers who had witnessed the sudden silence of German artillery and understood its significance. Within hours, every defender in Sevastopol knew that their sniper had accomplished something unprecedented in the history of warfare. German forces responded with a furious bombardment of the area where the shot had originated, but Ludmila and Dmitri had already relocated to a new position. They spent the next week moving constantly, avoiding the intense search efforts designed to locate and eliminate them while continuing to engage targets of opportunity. Her kill count had reached 301 when the order came for her immediate evacuation from Sevastopol. The decision came directly from Moscow, where political and military leaders had decided that Ludmila had become too valuable as a symbol to risk losing in the final battles for the city. The evacuation was accomplished by submarine, with Ludmila and a small group of other essential personnel being taken off the beach during a night operation that required precise timing and considerable courage from the naval crews involved. As the submarine slipped away from the burning city, Ludmila watched through the periscope as Sevastopol continued to burn under German bombardment. She would never return to active combat duty. Instead, she was assigned to training roles where her experience could be used to prepare the next generation of Soviet snipers. But her war record of 309 confirmed kills, including the longest shot in sniper history, had already secured her place in military legend. The story of her 3,247-meter shot would be studied by military academies for decades, not just as an example of extraordinary marksmanship but as a demonstration of what could be achieved through perfect preparation, flawless technique, and unshakable determination. It represented the pinnacle of sniper craft, a shot that combined science and art, calculation and intuition, in a moment of perfect execution under impossible conditions. Years later, when military historians attempted to analyze the technical aspects of the shot, they would conclude that it represented the absolute limit of what was possible with the weapons and technology available at the time. The combination of environmental factors, equipment capabilities, and human skill required for such a shot could not be improved upon, only duplicated under equally perfect conditions. But, for Ludmila, the significance of the shot was not technical but personal. It represented the culmination of her transformation from a university student studying chemistry to a warrior who had faced the ultimate test of skill and courage. In that moment when her bullet traveled across more than 3 kilometers of contested battlefield to find its target, she had achieved something that transcended military accomplishment and entered the realm of human possibility itself. The submarine carrying her away from Sevastopol was bound for a port where she would begin a new phase of her life, one that would take her far from the battlefields of the Soviet Union to places where her story would inspire people around the world to believe that ordinary individuals could achieve extraordinary things when circumstances demanded the very best of human capability and determination. The submarine journey from Sevastopol marked the end of one chapter of Ludmila's life and the beginning of another that would prove equally challenging in its own way. She was no longer fighting for survival against enemy snipers, but she was about to face a different kind of warfare, the battle for hearts and minds that would determine whether the sacrifices made at Sevastopol would have lasting meaning. Her first destination was Moscow, where she was debriefed by military intelligence officers who wanted to document every detail of her combat experience for use in training programs and tactical development. For weeks, she sat in windowless rooms answering questions about wind patterns, trajectory calculations, and the psychological aspects of sniper warfare, translating the intuitive knowledge she had gained through combat into technical language that could be taught to others. The bureaucratic process was exhausting in ways that combat had never been. In battle, decisions were clear-cut and consequences were immediate. In Moscow's military headquarters, everything was filtered through layers of political consideration and administrative procedure. Simple requests took days to process, while important decisions were delayed by committees and review boards that seemed more concerned with avoiding responsibility than achieving results. More difficult was the psychological adjustment to life away from the front lines. For months, Ludmila had lived in a world where every moment carried the possibility of death, where survival depended on constant vigilance and split-second decision-making. Now she found herself in environments where the greatest danger was boredom, where the skills that had kept her alive were no longer relevant to daily existence. She struggled with survivor's guilt, knowing that the friends and comrades she had left behind in Sevastopol were still fighting and dying while she sat in comfortable offices answering questions about her experiences. The rational part of her mind understood that her evacuation had been necessary, that her value as a symbol and trainer outweighed her contribution as a single combat soldier, but emotionally she felt like she had abandoned her post when her comrades needed her most. The situation became even more complex when she was informed that she would be traveling to the United States and Great Britain as part of a diplomatic mission designed to strengthen the alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western democracies. The idea was that her story would demonstrate Soviet determination and capability, encouraging greater support for the Eastern Front while countering Nazi propaganda about Soviet weakness and incompetence. Ludmila's initial reaction was skeptical. She was a soldier, not a diplomat, and she doubted that her experiences would translate effectively to audiences who had never faced the realities of total war. But her commanding officers made it clear that this was not a request but an order, and that her service to the Soviet Union was continuing in a different form. The journey to the United States in late 1942 was her first time outside the Soviet Union, and everything about the experience was disorienting. The abundance of consumer goods, the casualness of daily life, the absence of the constant tension that had defined existence in wartime Soviet Union, all of it seemed almost fantastical to someone who had spent months living in underground bunkers while fighting for national survival. Her first public appearance was at a rally in New York City, where she was introduced to an audience of several thousand people as Lady Death, the deadliest female sniper in history. The nickname, which had been created by American journalists, made her uncomfortable, but she understood its propaganda value and accepted it as part of her new role. The speech she delivered that night was carefully crafted by State Department officials and Soviet diplomatic personnel, designed to maximize emotional impact while conveying key political messages about the alliance between the Soviet Union and the United States. But when Ludmila stepped up to the microphone and looked out at the sea of faces in Madison Square Garden, she abandoned the prepared text and spoke from the heart. She talked about the soldiers who had died defending Sevastopol, about the courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, about the price of freedom and the responsibility that came with living in safety while others fought for survival. Her words, translated by interpreters who struggled to convey the passion and conviction in her voice, electrified the audience and established her as a speaker capable of moving people to action. The American tour continued for several weeks, taking her to cities across the country where she spoke to audiences ranging from military personnel to factory workers to high school students. Each appearance refined her ability to communicate across cultural and linguistic barriers, and she began to understand that her role as a messenger was potentially as important as her previous role as a sniper. The highlight of the American tour was a meeting with Eleanor Roosevelt, the president's wife, who had specifically requested to meet with Ludmila. The two women spent an afternoon walking through the gardens of the Roosevelt family estate, discussing topics ranging from women's rights to the challenges of leadership during wartime. Eleanor Roosevelt was particularly interested in Ludmila's experiences as a woman in combat, recognizing that her story challenged conventional assumptions about gender roles and capabilities. She encouraged Ludmilla to speak openly about the discrimination she had faced and the advantages she had discovered in being underestimated by her opponents. The conversation was a turning point for Ludmilla, helping her understand that her significance extended beyond military accomplishment to broader questions about human potential and social change. She began to see her story not just as a tale of individual achievement, but as evidence that societies could accomplish more by utilizing the talents and capabilities of all their citizens rather than limiting opportunities based on prejudice and tradition. The British leg of her tour was equally successful but different in tone and emphasis. British audiences were more focused on tactical and technical aspects of her achievements, wanting to understand the specific methods and techniques that had made her so effective. She found herself giving detailed presentations to military academies and intelligence services, sharing knowledge that would be used to improve British sniper training and doctrine. During her time in London, Ludmilla was introduced to other women who were making unconventional contributions to the war effort: codebreakers working on German communications, pilots ferrying aircraft between bases, engineers designing new weapons systems. These meetings helped her understand that her story was part of a larger transformation taking place across all the Allied nations, as the demands of total war forced societies to reconsider fundamental assumptions about human capability and social organization. The return journey to the Soviet Union took her through Canada, where she participated in training exercises with Canadian military units and observed their integration of sniper tactics into conventional infantry operations. The experience was professionally fascinating, showing her how the lessons learned on the Eastern Front were being adapted and applied in different theaters of the war. Back in Moscow, Ludmilla was assigned to the Central Women's School of Sniper Training, where she would spend the remainder of the war teaching the techniques and tactics she had developed through months of combat experience. The assignment was both reward and punishment: reward for her service and achievements, punishment for her growing independence and unwillingness to conform to bureaucratic expectations. The training school provided her with the opportunity to systemize her knowledge and develop formal curricula that would prepare the next generation of Soviet snipers for combat. She worked with other experienced snipers to create comprehensive programs covering everything from basic marksmanship to advanced camouflage and stalking techniques. More importantly, the school allowed her to pass on the psychological and tactical insights that could not be learned from textbooks or classroom instruction. She taught her students to read terrain and weather conditions, to anticipate enemy behavior, to remain patient during long periods of inactivity, and to make split-second decisions under extreme pressure. Her teaching methods were unconventional by military standards, emphasizing practical problem-solving over rote memorization and encouraging students to think independently rather than simply following established procedures. Some of her colleagues viewed this approach as potentially subversive, but the results spoke for themselves. Students trained under her program consistently outperformed those trained through conventional methods. As the war progressed and Soviet forces began driving German armies back toward their own borders, Ludmilla watched with mixed emotions as her former students applied the lessons she had taught them in battles across Eastern Europe. Their success vindicated her methods and demonstrated the value of her educational work, but she could not escape the feeling that she should be with them rather than remaining safely behind the lines. The end of the war in Europe brought both relief and uncertainty. The immediate threat to Soviet survival had been eliminated, but the future remained unclear. Ludmilla's wartime role as a trainer had given her valuable skills and experience, but it was uncertain how those capabilities would translate to peacetime service. She remained with the training school through 1946, helping to transition it from wartime operations to peacetime functions. The curriculum was modified to emphasize hunting and sporting applications rather than combat techniques, and the student body shifted from active military personnel to civilian hunters and competitive shooters. During this period, Ludmilla began writing her memoirs, documenting not just her combat experiences but her observations about warfare, leadership, and the transformation of Soviet society during the war years. The project allowed her to process the psychological impact of her experiences while creating a permanent record that would help future generations understand what the war had meant for ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances. The memoir, when it was finally published in 1957, became an international bestseller, translated into dozens of languages and read by millions of people around the world. It established Ludmilla as not just a military hero but as a thoughtful observer of human nature and social change, someone whose insights extended far beyond the technical aspects of sniper warfare. In her later years, Ludmilla continued to speak publicly about her experiences, but she increasingly focused on broader themes of courage, determination, and the importance of serving causes larger than oneself. She became an advocate for women's rights and educational opportunities, using her platform to encourage young people to pursue their goals regardless of social expectations or conventional limitations. Her final public appearance was at a ceremony commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Sevastopol, where she was honored alongside other veterans of that epic struggle. Standing before an audience that included former enemies as well as former allies, she spoke about the futility of war and the importance of understanding that former opponents shared common humanity and common hopes for the future. When Ludmilla Pavlichenko died in 1974, she was mourned not just in the Soviet Union but around the world. Her funeral was attended by representatives from dozens of nations, testament to the global impact of her story and the inspiration she had provided to millions of people who had never experienced combat but who recognized in her achievements evidence of human potential that transcended all boundaries. Her legacy lived on in the sniper training programs she had helped develop, in the memoir that continued to influence readers decades after its publication, and in the example she had set for anyone facing seemingly impossible challenges. The young chemistry student who had picked up a rifle to defend her homeland had become something far greater, a symbol of what ordinary people could achieve when circumstances demanded the very best of human capability and determination. The record she set with her 3,247-meter shot remained unbroken for decades, a testament to the perfect combination of skill, preparation, and courage that she had brought to that moment on a May morning in Sevastopol. But, more than any technical achievement, her story demonstrated that heroism was not the exclusive province of any particular group or gender, that courage and determination could emerge from unexpected sources when the stakes were high enough and the cause was worth defending.